For those who have just joined us, thank you so much for being on this early and having an interest in zoning and affordable housing. This Ask a Planner series is something that the councilman is hosting the last Friday of every month. And so far we've had guest speakers from community planning and development. Sometimes it will just be me here to answer any questions you have about planning and zoning in District 1. We are so thankful today to have Analiese here. She is going to be discussing how the city can get affordable housing, specifically in the private market, some of the tools the city is looking at, and then open for Q&A about District 1 specifically. So we are attempting to also live stream this on Facebook. And I believe that there may be a little bit of a hiccup with that, but we are all respectful of your time. So I think we'll just go ahead and start. So take it away, Analiese.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much. As Naomi said, I'm Analiese Hock and I'm with CPD. My primary focus and role is kind of what we call regulatory implementation. What does that actually mean? It means that it's my job to take our adopted plan policies, whether that's comp plan and Blueprint Denver or area specific plans, and transform them from a vision and a kind of high level policy into actual regulatory implementation, meaning that it takes that vision and turns it into a must or a system that when development comes through the door, those changes and modifications need to be made. So that's a little bit of what kind of I do in my day-to-day and where my specialty is. And the primary tool that we use in CPD to implement our adopted plans is through changes to the zoning code as well as the Denver Revised Municipal Code. So as Naomi said, I'm just going to talk with you guys a little bit this morning. I'm going to try to keep the presentation fairly brief since this really is Ask a Planner, not have a planner talk to you. But also want to give enough of a kind of shared understanding that I think we'll have a little bit more of a productive conversation there. So as we mentioned, CPD in partnership with HOST, which is our Office of Housing Stability, or actually department, excuse me, are working to find ways where we can leverage more affordable housing by market rate developers. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about what the program is, what affordable housing is, understanding zoning incentives, and then we'll kind of go from there. So just a quick reminder, I think so many times the word affordable housing is thrown around in the community. We certainly know that we need more of it, but really kind of what is that definition that we're using? It's really when housing is affordable, when individuals and families can pay for their housing, as well as still having sufficient money left over for necessities like food, healthcare, transportation, education, and other things like that. The federal government, which the city also uses this definition, we typically define housing as affordable when it consumes no more than 30% of that household's income. Once again, remaining amount of your income can go to other important aspects that support your livelihood. So when we're thinking about who needs affordable housing, it's not just one person. It's really everyone in the community, even from high income earners to home health care workers. Everyone in between is in need of affordable housing so they can thrive and contribute to life. Right now in Denver, and this data is even a little bit lagging because ACS data looks backwards, and that's the American Community Survey and Census data. But right now, what you can see, and I think everyone probably is feeling this, but essentially our incomes are not rising at the same rate of housing. And you can see that that gap is only widening. Today in Denver, 1 in 3 households are cost burdened, meaning that they are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And 1 in 5 households are severely cost burdened, meaning that they are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. That's really substantial. When we see those high cost burden numbers, we know that those folks are at risk of involuntary displacement, losing their home, their security, and other aspects. So this is really a growing challenge that we need to be addressing from a variety of different perspectives. These 4 pillars are from Housing and Inclusive Denver, which is HOST's 5-year strategic plan. And all of these play a critical role in how we support Denver's housing needs. Stabilizing residents at risk of involuntary displacement is really important. That's where temporary utility and rental assistance programs come into play. That's where property tax abatements come into play. And we really want to just be able to keep people in their homes. Promoting equitable access to housing through program investments or policy actions. This is really where Host is prioritizing some of their funding with nonprofit partners to ensure that we're creating housing that's accessible to a variety of incomes. And then the preservation ordinance is Host's primary tool to ensure that we're preserving those existing units. For those of you that might be more familiar with affordable housing, many of them have associated covenant restrictions that limit the length of affordability. And we're already seeing many of those from the earlier years of the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance, or IHO, expire. So preserving is really trying to maintain what existing affordable units we have so there's longer perpetuity. And then what this project is really kind of aiming to focus on and support is to create more affordable housing in areas that are vulnerable to displacement, as well as areas of opportunity that have good access to jobs, transportation, schools, healthcare, and so forth. And when we talk about creating affordable housing, though, this is not the only tool. It really fits into a broader ecosystem of how housing policies advance. Some of you might be familiar with the term AMI. What that really means is area median income. And this is published by HUD every year. And it looks at all the incomes for the Denver region, and it identifies kind of what that average is. What I've provided here is just so you have a little bit of an idea of when we're talking about someone at a 50% AMI, it varies based off of household size, but generally their income does not exceed somewhere from 35 to 50%. I think a lot of times people think, oh, 50 AMI, like that must be really low. That was definitely where I was for my first couple of years in my planning career. So I think it's important to remind ourselves that these income levels have been also growing really high, and that a 50% AMI person really isn't someone that needs those supportive social services that we sometimes hear concerns around. So I just want to give it a quick overview. All of these programs are really where the city and Host is creating policies, programs, and putting their funding allocation to support the creation of affordable housing across that housing continuum. And right now, the city is really prioritizing more of their funds into the deeper AMIs, as we call it, more in the those experiencing homelessness, 30–50% AMIs, where we're seeing more of those funding allocations and resources going. However, the Affordable Housing Fund does go and serve incomes all the way up to 80% of the area median income. If you're interested on the specific funding allocations, I'll put a link in the chat there, but it can be found on the Host dashboard online. So those are all the programs through LIHTC, through D3, through GAP financing that essentially the city is partnering with nonprofit affordable housing developers or Denver Housing Authority to create units that kind of go up to typically a 60% AMI serving. Where there's an opportunity, though, for us is to create complementary city programs and resources, one of which being zoning incentives to better leverage the private market to also be providing affordable housing. So all those in kind of like the lighter seafoam green color are really programs that are using significant public subsidy to reach that. And zoning incentives are another tool that we can use to attract the private market to provide some affordable housing. So that's a little bit on kind of affordable housing. We'll jump back into zoning incentives, but kind of why are we doing this? Part of it is there's a significant and growing housing need, and that's really important that we address this not only from Host perspective, but looking at how do we leverage land use tools in an effective way that creates more equitable outcomes. Some of you may be familiar with Comprehensive Plan 2040 that was adopted in spring of 2019, and it has 6 vision elements. And throughout that process, which was kind of known as Denverite, which was the umbrella term, there were over 24,000 touch points with the community. And probably the most common and resounding theme throughout the process was the need for more affordable housing and equitable growth. So this regulatory implementation project, as I'm calling it, is really the first citywide initiative coming out of these to really implement some of the bold and exciting strategies identified in Comp Plan 2040. So in terms of what the specific project purpose is, we're really looking at creating a system of incentives to encourage the creation of affordable housing and mixed income housing, especially in transit-rich areas. And we want to primarily do this through citywide zoning incentives and other regulatory tools. So as compared to all those other tools that HOST is focused on that are primarily financial incentives, we're looking at how we can be leveraging zoning incentives to achieve that. It's really important that it's done in such a way that the system actually leads to the creation of affordable housing and affordable housing that meets the needs of the community. Additionally, it's important too that this creates predictability for the neighborhood as well as the developer. This is a piece that I'll talk a little bit more on, but predictability, clarity of expectations, knowing what's going to happen, not feeling like everything has to be a negotiated outcome that leads to inconsistent resources, something that we're wanting to solve for in here. So in terms of kind of the project process, I'll talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. So we did kick off this project in kind of the winter early of this year, right before COVID hit. And that really began with the evaluation of best practices and programs in other peer cities that have both incentive systems, and as well, some of those also have inclusionary based systems, which I'll talk about briefly. We looked at all of those as well as the pilot project at the 38th and Blake Station area, and really wanted to identify what are some of those lessons learned, how should we thinking it, how can we learn from other peer cities, how can we learn from our pilot program, what do we need to improve upon before we create a citywide system for zoning incentives. We are now to the point where we are starting to think about evaluating potential alternatives, and this is where financial feasibility is something that comes into play and is really important. You know, in any development project, what you commonly hear from the development community is, well, if it pencils and it's a good deal, I'll do it. And if the economics don't work, I won't. And because this is an incentive-based system, we need to make it attractive to where that incentive is properly calibrated to that community benefit of affordable housing. So that's a big aspect, as well as talking to folks like you guys to start thinking about what are the different ways that we could create an incentive system and kind of understand the pros and cons of each of those. Then later on in subsequent phases, we'll want to actually confirm our incentive strategy. So instead of just looking at 4 different ways that we could tackle this, we'll want to have one preferred strategy that would eventually lead to the drafting of zoning code language and other code language in the DRMC, at which point then it would move through the legislative review process with planning board and city council. Continuum across this process has been not only advisory committee meetings, but talking to folks like yourself through partnerships with council offices, working with other neighborhood organizations and groups. I think this is my 4th variation of a presentation just this week. So we are wanting to get out and just talk to folks as much as possible and have dialogues around values and what's important when we look at how we leverage incentives for affordable housing. So just kind of at a high level, incentive zoning is something that's tossed around a lot, and so this is just really trying to simplify it, but it's really a tool to encourage a developer to provide a public benefit in exchange for what might be seen as relaxed standards or additional height. And so when you might have a by right development of say 3 stories, say the incentive were to allow for a 5-story building, part of that additional density provides a profit to the developer. And the city is saying, okay, but in exchange for that, we're going to take part of that profit and ask you, or require you actually now, to build a portion of those as affordable units to help offset that cost. And so it's a way that we're trying to create a system where communities can benefit from it, from a portion of that increased development capacity. This is a question that comes up in almost every meeting, and many folks are familiar with it, but I think it's a good reminder of just, you know, incentives are great, but why are we not requiring affordable housing? That seems like the easiest way to address this. In the early 80s, Colorado prohibited rent control, and it was really, I think, intended at that point to be kind of a don't do what New York does, where you know, private landlords and things like that are limited in what they can rent out their units for. However, then in the early 2000s, there's what's commonly known as the Telluride decision, and it essentially determined that inclusionary housing policies, which essentially state, for example, 10% of all new units must be income restricted. It determined that if you apply those restrictions on rental housing, that was identified to be a form of rent control and therefore in violation of the rent control statute, and inclusionary housing policies could only apply for for sale housing. So because of that, the city must work within involuntary and incentive systems to achieve our affordable housing. When we create an incentive, a developer is not required to do that. They are opting into that option. And so it's kind of a little bit of a workaround associated with those state limitations. Another important piece to note is that Denver actually did have an inclusionary housing ordinance from the early 2000s up until 2016, at which point it was replaced with the linkage fee. And it did some great production in areas like Green Valley Ranch and Stapleton/City Park. But the majority of new multifamily housing that we see coming on the market is really rentals. So we're missing out on that opportunity. And that's where the linkage fee is attempting to better capture those impacts to be able to leverage affordable housing. As I made mention, and some of you may be less familiar with it because it is outside of your neighborhoods and districts, but a couple of years ago, the city initiated kind of a 38th and Blake Station Area Plan Amendment with kind of direction from the council office at that time. And it went through a process of redefining base and incentive heights. The base heights range anywhere from 2 to 8 stories, and the incentive heights range anywhere from 3 to 16 stories. That was then adopted in 2017 and followed up by the actual overlay, which held pretty closely and true to that incentive-based system. It was adopted about a year ago. And in terms of kind of outcomes today, there's a couple of pieces that I want to notice in terms of what we've identified as the benefits and drawbacks. I will also note that there's about 8 pages of content on this in terms of write-up and development details in the background report if you're interested in that as well. But essentially what we're seeing is half of the projects that have since come through the development review process are leveraging the incentive that has resulted in 4 approved projects that in total have provided 36 affordable units as a result of that incentive requirements. It's averaging around 5.6% as affordable, but how the incentive system is set up is actually quite complex and varies significantly by square footage and use type. And so some projects were averaging closer to 9% and some, closer to 3%. So it sort of speaks to the unpredictability of the system in terms of community benefit. It does, however, create a predictable system for developers. It is very formulaic based, and they're running formulas all day, as well as capturing the impacts of both commercial and residential projects. However, there are certainly some drawbacks that have been identified that we need to be watching more closely as we look to a citywide system. The base height in many instances is sufficient for the majority of the development. Many areas, especially near the station area, has a base height of 8 stories, which really once you go over 8 stories kicks you into a different construction type, and that cost really doesn't warrant it. So much of the development is actually just building within that base height, not needing to leverage that incentive. Additionally, those yield of affordable units is much lower than anticipated, so ensuring that the pro forma and the analysis is spot on is really critical to the success of this project. And then the requirement of affordable units is at 80%. And this does align with the citywide linkage fee build alternative of 80% area median income. But when we look at the area and the actual community need, it's really not serving many of those residents that are there currently and are in need of affordable housing. So we kind of want to pivot away from a one size fits all. We also looked at a series of peer cities, Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Jose, Seattle, Austin, Minneapolis, and Portland. All of these don't have the silver bullet. And many of these programs really have only been implemented in the past 2 to 3 years to respond to growing affordable housing needs. So, it's great because we have a few years of experience to kind of look at what their successes and failures have been, but we don't have 10 years of saying that really worked well. One thing that we certainly see happening is that many of these peer cities have a tiered requirement that's based off of a range of AMI targets, area median income, rather than just a standard one-size-fits-all requirement. So 38th and Blake is just a standard 80%. Many of those go even down to 30% area median income in some instances. Additionally, linkage fees, which is a fee that's assessed on all new development, are much higher than Denver's currently. In some instances, those go all the way up to $35 per square foot. and they more accurately reflect the cost of actually developing those affordable units. In Denver, we're still under $2 a square foot. And then the requirement of affordable units is much higher than Denver's currently in 38th and Blake. Many of them are in the 15 to 20% of affordable units is leveraged by that incentive. The last piece here that we kind of learned is that all of these conditions were really present for those programs that produce significant outcomes in terms of affordable housing. In Atlanta, Los Angeles, Portland, there was certainly a pent-up demand for both affordable as well as market rate housing. In Los Angeles, we saw that they have a very low base heights to start with, so there's always a need to go higher than what those base entitlements are, as well as ample opportunity to apply those bonus incentive systems along transportation corridors, moderate to high density districts, and within planned residential areas. It's not just so we're going to pick one neighborhood and apply this, but they can apply it broadly, and so there's more opportunity for applicability. As made mentioned before, the fees in lieu accurately reflect the cost of developing those affordable units. And there are additional incentives within those programs just beyond density of height and additional units. Many of those include expedited permit review or tax relief for other associated programs. And then the last piece here that we're also really looking at closely is proper calibration of submarket costs and demands. So realizing that the demand and the need for housing and the ability for areas like downtown Denver to accommodate more growth in alignment with the Blueprint Denver growth strategy is going to look different, say, than what it's going to look like in District 1, where we have more of an urban context. Land costs are relatively lower than, say, downtown, but also looking at the demand. Pivoting a little bit to now kind of moving forward as we start to think about how we create this citywide incentive system, it's really important that each of these balance multiple community objectives. There's never going to be one program that checks off all of these perfectly, but there are questions and prompts that we've developed with our advisory committee and in consultation with the community to make sure that when we're looking at how an incentive system could work, is it meeting these sort of different metrics? The first being around equity. Does the proposed incentive system take into account the different needs of Denver's neighborhoods and produce equitable outcomes? Once again, this is not equality, so it's not treating every neighborhood exactly the same, but it's acknowledging that there are different housing needs, income needs, housing type needs across Denver, and so that the incentive system should be accommodating and realizing those. The second piece that's really important here is market reality. Will the proposed system attract the development community to use the incentive and work in different markets? It shouldn't be something that only works, say, in downtown or only works in Berkeley. It should be something that works effectively and produces affordable housing for all of our neighborhoods in Denver. Clear expectations is something that's really important and was a huge learning lesson from 38th and Blake. It not only needs to provide that clarity to the development community, they have the resources to figure it out, it really needs to provide that clarity of outcomes and expectations to the community on the front end. And the last piece here is sometimes boring, but really critical to the success of any longevity of the program, is ensuring that we don't create something that's so overly complex that it can't be successfully implemented, administered, tracked, and monitored over time. You know, we're looking at 60 or 99-year affordability commitments that would be associated with these incentives. We need to be able to maintain that in perpetuity over time. So just a quick reminder of what a successful incentive system is going to look like for us. These are voluntary programs where if they're structured properly, they can really benefit both the community and the developer. Therefore, these programs should be generating units that benefit those low-income households and contribute to the expansion of affordable housing in Denver. And because of that, attracting developer participation is critical to the success of the program, because this is really focusing on how do we get the private market to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. You know, we have a lot of great partners that work already with the city to develop affordable housing. We're trying to break into another niche here. So just one common question that we kind of get, you know, we talk about in transit-rich areas and centers and corridors. So where will this incentive apply? None of this is final by any means, but we are, you know, really wanting to focus it on where people can access opportunity. And so for those of you that might be familiar with the Blueprint Denver Future Places designation, All of these are going to be calibrated differently, but we are looking at all of the different centers, ranging from local, community, and regional, to as well as local and community centers, as well as our residential high areas, which are really those high intensity multi-unit districts. So that's where it's seeking to apply. All of the other areas that are kind of residential, low, medium, and low will be examined through subsequent processes and projects to look at how affordable housing can better be leveraged in those areas within the city. So in terms of kind of next steps of where our project is going, we're pivoting away from lessons learned and evaluation of our existing programs to now starting to develop and evaluate different alternatives. We have conducted financial feasibility analysis, which is online, to determine essentially what level of incentives are needed to provide a strong commitment to affordable housing. We're looking at some of the variations and kind of the 4 pieces that we've really identified that will likely create variance within the citywide system is market sub-costs. So what is the cost of land and the rents achieved, that providing more opportunity and flexibility in the performas, the zoning and blueprint places context, realizing that downtown is very different than general urban, which is different than the urban and urban edge, which is primarily in District 1, and different from suburban. And then the equity considerations are a key concept that not only Blueprint guides us to look at through our implementation projects, but really provide an important lens in thinking around what are the community needs and how do we create systems that can respond and be tailored to that. We're also exploring the expansion of expedited review and fee reduction pilot program. And then we're examining other incentives related to vehicle parking and removing existing known barriers to the development of affordable housing. So I will stop there. The project website is denvergov.org/affordability incentive. There we have a lot of information from just a simple kind of 1-pager. If you want to, if some of you are with our notes and want to distribute that, if you like to dive into the details, the entire background report that kind of speaks about affordable housing need, past programs, engaged fee inclusionary housing ordinance, and the outcomes of 38 and Blake. That's all within there. And then we also have an interim alternatives report, which speaks to the financial feasibility. So with that, I will stop. I haven't been able to track the chat, so I'll ask maybe Naomi to try to moderate some questions, and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Analiese. So we have a question from Jason Horniak, and I think you've touched a little bit on this already, but he asked what other incentives besides height have been considered, like removing parking minimums, loosening setback requirements. So that's the first part, if there's any detail you want to go in on that. And then secondly, he asked, I think a very good question, does this plan have a contingent for when, fingers crossed, Telluride is overturned by state legislature next year?
Yeah, I like the win. 2 great questions. So the first one, definitely beyond height, we realize that is very attractive in some markets, but not all markets for Denver. And we certainly see with affordable housing projects, we do not have effective parking reductions right now in our code. And we've seen in the past year, actually 2 projects almost die, if you will, because they could not provide the parking on the site because they were, highly constrained sites that were more affordable to purchase, so an affordable housing developer could leverage them. So that is certainly something that we know is a barrier, but we need to also be thoughtful about. As parking does have impacts both ways. And then kind of loosening setback requirements. In many instances where this would apply, it's really going to be our mixed use and our Main Street zone districts, and many of those actually have 0-foot setbacks already. The one piece that we are wanting to examine, though, is our protected district standards, and it's a little bit of a push and a pull. We've certainly identified that in some instances our protected district standards aren't achieving the intended protections, if you will, when they are adjacent to single unit and 2-unit and those lower scale residential uses. So we're wanting to look at how we can improve those, but also at the same time provide a little bit more flexibility to those projects as well. So it's a little bit of a push and a pull in terms of how we're looking at those sorts of things. We're also looking at an expansion of what's a current pilot project right now for kind of an expedited review as well as fee reductions. So that is certainly under consideration as well. Another piece that comes up quite often in conversation is property tax abatement. You typically see this in New York commonly has it. Seattle also has a program. But they're both the states have specifically enabled that. And right now we have a little bit of challenges between kind of Gallagher and Tabor around those programs, but it's something that Host is continuing to pursue as an additional form of subsidy. So those are all the other incentives. Height's a really critical one, but it's not the only one that will lead to the success. And then the second piece here is, does this plan have a contingency for when Telluride is overturned by our state legislature next year? I really hope that that statement is true as well. So as I made mention, Telluride is kind of the current way in which we must operate of an incentive-based system. A bill was drafted last year and was intended to be heard by the state legislature. Unfortunately, COVID really significantly impacted what the state could hear and kind of moved on forward. Those same bill sponsors are bringing forth another bill in the 2021 legislative session. So we are very closely tracking that with our partners, and we do have, I don't know if contingency is the right word, but we do have some side scope built in to see how the incentive system would need to pivot if we could have a base inclusionary requirement. So that's something that we're constantly looking at, but we also don't want to wait just for the state, because as much as I'm hopeful that this will change in the coming year, it's something that we as a city can't guarantee. So we also want to be sure that we're advancing policies in which we have the legal space to do so.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks. So we've we've made everyone able to speak if they'd like to. If you're a participant or an attendee, you're welcome to click the raise your hand button down at the bottom. I should have mentioned that earlier. If you have a question in addition to putting it in the chat. But Jason, I heard you there. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions. Definitely, this is meant to be a conversation. If we were all, in person sitting together, we could have a much more informal conversation, especially with a smaller group like this. So feel free to engage and go ahead and ask Analiese more questions. Jason?
Oh, yeah, Analiese did a great job answering my questions. I don't have a follow-up, but I do have an additional question, but I can wait for anyone else if there are other questions, because I don't want to hog.
Yeah,
okay. So Analiese, thank you for the presentation. That was great. So how will this plan have any, I know this is just for mostly higher density and transit rich areas, but will there be any work with the upcoming residential infill project? I'm thinking specifically if we're adding missing middle housing in our residential areas, will there be other incentives for those? Like if someone were to build a fourplex in a residential neighborhood, then maybe would you look into incentives by limiting setback requirements or some permitting things or parking in those neighborhoods? Is there any interaction with the upcoming residential infill program?
Yeah, great question, Jason. So for, some of you may or may not be familiar with a project called residential infill. And when I was kind of showing that blueprint Denver future places type, I said, the residential low and low medium are going to be tackled through an upcoming project. And what that's currently called is residential infill. And the aim of that project is kind of threefold. In no particular order of importance, one of which is just looking at overall design outcomes in those lower intensity zone districts. And a resounding theme in Blueprint Denver is that we actually don't have the context-based code that we thought we did in terms of new development is significantly out of proportion, out of context with that existing character. So it's looking at design and how do we improve those outcomes. It's also looking at how do we integrate more missing middle housing types of duplexes, ADUs, tandem houses and fourplexes where appropriate into more neighborhoods to expand that housing diversity. And then kind of the third component is how do we also integrate affordability requirements and or incentives built into those. So that's kind of a high level of what that project is about, and it will be kind of kicking off a little bit later than this one has. But in terms of kind of overlap and coordination, these two projects, while Abe Barge, the project manager, is not here today, and I won't attend all of his meetings. We coordinate weekly on these two projects. Even though the timing's a little bit different, we see these as highly complementary in terms of how we use land use policy to tackle housing affordability across the city in all of our residential and mixed use areas. So we are coordinating on that. And they're, I think, probably even more so than this project, going to be really examining those building form standards and allowances and things like that. Currently, actually, in our single and 2 unit zone district, sorry, just single unit, we actually don't have any parking requirements. But I think that, as they look at potentially, enabling, say, a duplex in areas previously only allowed for single unit, I know parking will certainly be a discussion point there as well. But all of these things are kind of what we want to look at rather than what we need to change. So all of that will be informed by analysis and community conversation.
Cool, thanks so much. I'll hop in with a question that kind of jumps off of that too. So as you've touched on already a little bit, how are these tailored? Like, what does that process look like? How are these tailored to, for instance, District 1, with like thinking about maybe 38th, and what kind of heights look in there, and what does that community engagement look like, and how do we make sure that the incentives are still appropriate to how the community feels about what heights should be where, and especially when we've got these areas where there's single family homes right next to busy corridors that are already getting taller buildings built there.
Yeah, great question, Naomi, and it's probably one that everyone's wondering. It's the importance of, just because we're creating a citywide system does not mean it's a one size fits all. And I think we're really fortunate in the sense that we have recently adopted Blueprint Denver, which did spend the time to update what was formerly a fairly out-of-date plan, looked at those neighborhood plans for those areas, and then conducted a lot of community outreach. And I know many of the folks in District 1 were very vocal and engaged in that process, which I think is really helpful for setting the stage of how do we think about appropriateness of heights. And that's where, I think the context-based system does set us up to ensure that there is an appropriateness, where downtown we could be looking at 100% density bonus of doubling, what could be there to achieve more affordable housing in that area. Whereas our urban context, which I believe 38 is primarily, are kind of still those moderate building heights of anywhere from 3 to 5 stories. And so kind of introducing 10 and 12 story buildings really would not be within the context or the character of that area. So hopefully there's some assurance that we as staff know our plans and we know the community conversations that have been had to date. That being said, that's just our starting point, and then it's going and having discussions such as these. We'll still do kind of the bigger community meetings around the city. But I personally find those are good for informing people about what's going on, but they're not good for getting feedback or having dialogue like this. So our kind of outreach approach, and I think it's always evolving, has COVID completely kind of turned our approach on its head, and as things evolve and change, we're having to adapt to that. But I think it's trying to have smaller kind of geographically based conversations with folks to really have an understanding about what are the trade-offs. Because I know that height and density are scary and triggering words for many people. It means change. It means new people in my neighborhood that I might not know. So we realize that these are going to be hard and complicated conversations to have. But we're hoping that people already showing up at a 8 a.m. meeting on Friday morning shows a willingness of interest and commitment to ensure that we get these scaled appropriately, while also ensuring that the incentive is tangible and meaningful enough that it actually leads to the production of those affordable units. So a lot of just kind of small conversations to the what's the outreach strategy. We'll of course have online surveys and other opportunities for feedback. I know not everyone's always comfortable chiming in on a Zoom call, or sometimes it's a lot of information to process, and then, you know, a week or two later you've had time to reflect. But, you know, those are the pieces that we're looking at, is really what is the existing plan guidance and how can the community help articulate that even further in the context of this project.
Awesome, thank you so much. We have another question in the chat from Paul. Thank you, Paul. This is a really excellent question. So he asks, how does the city go about balancing issues of providing more housing, which of course is needed, with the reality that new housing is inherently more expensive than older housing? And he says, I feel like the only housing we see built is luxury. And I think this is such an interesting question because it really gets at, honestly, these problems we run up against of just cost of construction, cost of, you're right, existing housing is inherently more affordable. And if we're gonna also bring in values like sustainability and stuff too, which people care about, of course, you know, there's embodied energy in it. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. I'll talk about it in two contexts. And absolutely, new housing is always more expensive than what it replaces. Costs are more significant, especially if you're replacing an existing structure. That's why for like Res Infill and Blueprint Denver kind of plugs these ideas, but looking at how we can encourage or require the preservation of existing structures and kind of be able to leverage those a little bit more effectively. So one idea that Blueprint, you know, proposes is, say if you have a smaller house on the front, that's providing entry-level attainable housing, if you will, to the market. Instead of, if you scraped that and put on, say, 2 brand new duplexes, I can guarantee you they'll, you know, at least be in the 700s up, depending on which neighborhood in Denver you're at. Instead, can we say, if you preserve your existing building, we'll allow you to build another larger secondary, what we call tandem house, in the rear in exchange for preserving that. So I think that is at the forefront of our minds, is how can we be creative in the preservation of existing housing stock while also adding to housing stock. So the goal is not to see how many scrapes and new rebuilds we can have with more units, because we know that's not going to be successful. Rather, how do we leverage the existing housing stock that we have and improve that? So I think that's kind of the case a little bit more for our more low and moderate density. I also think, you know, Capitol Hill in many ways, and I live in City Park West, is a great example of how existing larger single unit homes have since been converted into condos and smaller, more affordable apartments. And now, while that's not a strategy that's effective everywhere in the city, I think it does show, though, an appropriateness of model of how we can reuse those existing buildings. As it pertains a little bit more to the zoning incentive project in those higher intensity areas, absolutely. Every new product that's coming in, well, not everything is luxury grade. It's typically type A class is kind of what we call it, meaning that the rents are going to be significantly more than just the citywide average, which is why we want to ensure that when new units come online, a portion of those are income restricted as affordable. So we are creating a little bit more equitable development in the sense that a portion of those units are going to be benefiting that existing community in place. So I think we're wanting to, as the best we can, not just have fully market rate projects coming online, but really getting to creating mixed income affordable units.
Great, thank you. I have a little bit more of a question too. I agree with Paul. I feel like the only housing we see built is luxury. And since you just brought up kind of class A, class B, that type of thing, I do know that sometimes, I mean, luxury is a marketing thing. You can say that your house is luxury no matter what it is, I believe. But what is, since I know you have been diving into kind of what the rents are, in these newer built things, and what that looks like in terms of how much you'd have to make. We call that area median income, you know, like what on the scale of how most people are earning would you really have to make to afford something like that? Would you mind just diving a little bit more into, you know, yeah, I think you have a slide about it. Perfect. Yeah. This is super interesting.
So this is, once again, if you like to dig into long documents, because we as planners like to make them, I know it's a problem, but so this is our interim alternatives report, but what it has in here for probably the first 10 or so pages is recent development trends. And so it has it geographically based, it has it use based, but what might be a little bit helpful, and it doesn't have exactly what you're speaking to, and I can kind of give a generalization there. But it does essentially have kind of what we're seeing as the effective rents for those areas, and kind of associated square footage, price per square foot, and kind of the proportion of unit mix, which does vary by building height and geography, but all of these are averages here just for kind of quick comparison. But as you can see, what's the average of what's being built right now for a 2-bedroom is just over $2,500 in terms of effective rent. And so when we go back to that sort of area median income, that's really close to someone that's making, you know, 180% of the area median income if you want to only be spending 30% of your income on housing. And so we're really seeing this kind of gap between what the nonprofit affordable developers can build, which is typically around up to 60 with some variations based on income averaging. And then we really see the new market construction is in some of our lower cost areas can get to 100%, but in most instances is, you know, far over the 100% area median income. And so what we're really hoping that this tool can come in and play is kind of fit into where that gap, where the market's not going to produce it without some incentives or encouragement. And it's not where we want to be putting our city dollar resources, because we really want to prioritize those on folks that have the highest need of cost burden and are the most vulnerable to displacement. So if you're interested in that, and then over here on the right-hand side is the column in comparison to affordable multifamily projects. And so just comparing, you know, the 2-bedroom cost of an affordable unit to the 2-bedroom cost of an income restricted, you know, it's basically half of that. So just a kind of quick comparison. And so if you're interested in that, where, you know, all the projects over the past 5 years have been built, which ones were mixed income, which ones were income restricted, what we see as trends in building heights and things like that. So since I was just up here, so you now know how to navigate our website, so there's a lot of information on here. When we as a city host upcoming meetings, we'll put them here. If I'm coming to something at Council District 1 or an RNO, I'm not going to post that because I've essentially been invited. If you're interested on who's on the advisory committee, it's there. My contact information is here, so if you're part of an RNO or some sort of community group that would like to engage in a discussion, just shoot me an email and we'll get that set up. 1-page project overview. Also, if you're interested, we do have a little bit of kind of a overview of just what is affordable housing. So that's a video, and I believe it's also available in Spanish on YouTube as well. And then that background report that I talked about with all the outcomes of 38th and Blake and Peer City research is found here in this document. And then the interim alternatives report is here, and that's where all that market-based research is also found. And then we did a webinar, I guess about a month ago now exactly, but it was essentially kind of on how development works and what goes into the development process. So if you're interested in learning about that, that's been a webinar that you can go and see that recording on YouTube that a handful of people have found useful. So lots of data points on there, but just wanted to show folks where they might be able to find more resources too.
Great, thanks so much. And as Gina also put into the chat, if you're an RNO or just any community group, if you want to get together a couple of people and learn more about this, I know going forward, Analiese and others in this project are always happy to have smaller conversations within the community. You know, one of the best ways to spread the word about things is honestly just by talking to your neighbors. You know, if if each of you go and tell 5 people about what you learned today and about, you know, how the city is thinking about this and that this is something to keep an eye on over, you know, the coming months, then hopefully they'll go tell 5 people. And, you know, that's how we get the word out there and get people engaged. And we're also happy that you guys are here early on a Friday morning to learn about super wonky, wonderful, wonderful zoning and planning things. So I don't see any more questions.
I have another question, Naomi.
Oh, I couldn't tell if you had just left your
My
hand
hand
up.
was raised.
It has been raised, Jason.
Oh. Well, I always have questions.
You always have questions. Yes, please go ahead, Jason.
This is Jason again, if you couldn't tell. So, Analiese, you mentioned that words like density and height can be scary words for people. And I'm sure many people will watch this presentation and think to themselves, oh, well, why are developers getting incentives and not me, the person who lives in the neighborhood next to this development? What's in it for me? So I think it's important, or could you maybe speak to the indirect incentives and benefits that neighborhoods and residents could receive from increased density? Like, for example, would it be fair to expect or assume future increased investment in transit if the density of a transit corridor were to be increased by a project like this?
Yeah, another great question. So I don't want to promise anything on behalf of RTD, but they are a close partner, and you know, an aspect of how we're wanting to be thoughtful and thinking about this, of ensuring that we have the infrastructure in place to support that density, but also I think there's the other way around of RTD puts transit where there are people and where there is need. So I think that's a great example of something that could be a byproduct, and a hopeful byproduct of this is enhanced transit capacity and further advancing the Denver Moves transit plan. I'll speak maybe less plannery and more just personally, and I think that affordable housing, and why I think we need to be advocating for it in all of our communities, and why it's such an underpinning of Denver, is because all of those people at every income level contribute to our community. If you think about the barista, if they can live close to their work and do that, they are supporting your community. You get to know those neighbors. If you are someone that needs to hire a nanny or childcare, the fact that they have an affordable housing option where they can live in your community and you can build that reciprocity of kind of understanding, I think that creates more cohesive, strong, and resilient communities, rather than if we continue our patterns of not achieving enough affordable housing, and it leads to involuntary displacement of so many of our cherished residents and neighborhoods. We're losing such a critical aspect of what made Denver what it is today, and what it, I think, can continue to be and grow stronger as, when people have housing. I also think of, you know, for those of you that might be familiar with Pavlov's hierarchy of needs, you know, food, sleep, and housing are at the very basic levels, and when those aren't being provided to our community, we kind of see the challenges associated with those. But when people can have safe, stable housing, they're able to thrive in their communities, they're able to better themselves, and I think we have stronger neighborhoods as a whole. So hopefully, you know, those are some of the ways that I think about it and why I do this work, because I deeply care about the work that I get to do. But, you know, think about it a little bit more personally. I know some folks, you know, I don't know if any of you guys are from Chaffee Park. I apologize. I don't know everyone's names.
That's me.
Yeah, but I know, you know, one of the testimonies that came up was, you know, my mom retired, and we were wanting to, you know, move her into the neighborhood, but we couldn't find anything below $400,000, and that's just not feasible. So for them, they were looking at an ADU. That's great in some instances, and in other instances too, we might want to be able to provide some multi-unit housing that is also at an income level. So it's not just, you know, your barista or your nanny or your friend, but it's also your family members too that might want to live close to you in your neighborhood, and without options for affordable housing, that might not be feasible or a resource.
as a beautiful answer. Thank you very, very much for that. I just want to sing some praises for you and the rest of the folks that work at CPD, especially Andrew Webb, for your human compassion when it comes to these projects you work on. I'm speaking specifically about group living now, but you guys are doing great work, and you have such a heart and care for our community, from planning things to the people who live here. So thank you very much for all the work you do.
Thank you, and I'll pass it along.
Thanks, Jason. Gina.
Hi, this is Gina, and I'm one of Councilman Sandoval's aides. And I am hoping that County Commissioner Odoricio did not want to remain anonymous because I just called him out. So wanted to welcome County Commissioner Odoricio. He's from Adams County, but he grew up in the north side. So just wanted to see if he had any questions or if he knew of anything that Adams County is doing similar to what Denver is looking at.
Hello, this is going to be pretty anticlimactic. I am actually aide to Commissioner Odoricio. I'm sure the commissioner would say something really grand and profound right now. Unfortunately, those words escape me. Thank you very much for allowing me to take notes for him in the background.
Awesome. What's your name?
So my name is Andres. It's very nice to meet you. So Naomi, I was the guy who asked you for a recording of the presentation. So I'm actually on my own account.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, anyway, I'm so sorry.
No, you're good. And I'm glad that it's very exciting that you're here taking notes too, because I think that one thing that we can talk about a little bit is like how affordable housing is a regional issue. And it's difficult because, you know, I know there is a lot of cross collaboration. I'm sorry, my dog is growling in the background. There is collaboration, but you know, lines on a map are not real, and this is a regional issue. So if you feel like speaking I know we're totally catching you off guard, but if you have anything to say to those regards, you're welcome to, but maybe I'll also kind of kick this over to Analiese and ask a little bit, how are we coordinating with our surrounding jurisdictions and thinking about housing as a region?
Yeah, definitely. I know that our housing department takes the lead a little bit more on the regional collaboration of housing as compared to my role, which is really focused on how do we change the zoning framework within the city of Denver. But also part of that is like earlier this week, I was speaking to a group called Neighborhood Development Collaborative. While that group is primarily focused on Denver, it has a ton of affordable housing developers that used to primarily develop in Denver, but have since kind of acknowledged the need that, hey, a lot of those folks that previously lived in Denver that we were serving have now since moved to Lakewood or Commerce City or Adams County or elsewhere. And so they've also had to expand their network, and we also had folks on the call from Boulder. So I think in some ways, I'm really trying to seek out groups that have a really strong base of understanding and care for Denver, but also have that regional perspective of what are the challenges in these other communities, what can we be leveraging, what are the partnerships and ways that we can get creative, because housing really is a regional challenge, and how we think about it. And so it's great to see collaboration there. And I think too, collaboration at the state level is at an all-time high, and something that we're really excited about and kind of tracking to make sure that, you know, there's not a missed opportunity when state law changes, that we're ready to jump on it and tackle it fully. So.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? I'd be super interested to know, for the rest of you who are listening in, what neighborhood you're in District 1. District 1 is such a wonderful and unique district. It's so diverse. We've got everything from, you know, the city center, basically, or right near it, going out into our older suburbs. There's, you know, when Analiese and I were talking, or if anyone here is from Sunnyside, we've been looking a lot and working with Sunny on the the station area, basically, the kind of our only little industrial section down there. Oh, Paul, West Colfax, nice. Yeah, West Colfax, super interesting area. We've got the Gulch there, and your area actually right now is undergoing the neighborhood planning initiative, which is going to be the topic of our next Ask a Planner, actually, and this is all very intertwined. So, Brun, yes, Gina. Berkeley Regis. Awesome.
And just because Naomi kind of reminded me in the West Colfax, Paul, you know, another thing is, okay, how does this, you know, relate to our implementation projects, but also how does it relate to neighborhood planning initiative? West Colfax the West Neighborhood Plan is really at a great timing with this project, where we know enough about where it can go and what's feasible and what you know, likely to happen, and they're also kind of getting to their place in the planning stages where they're wanting to develop plan policy recommendations. And so I think it's actually a great pairing of these two projects and kind of how they're concurrently being run, that we can have informed conversations back and forth. And I think a month or so ago, I went and talked to their steering committee a little bit about this and residential infill, and how those planning processes can help inform these broader citywide implementation and help us to tailor those things appropriately. So it's exciting that that's going on, and we can have additional conversations through that planning effort.
Definitely. All right, anybody have other questions? Jason, I'm sure you have more. Like,
No, I'm good.
Nice. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. We have been recording this webinar, and it will be made available so that you can share it, go back and look at things again. And the link to the website that Analiese was referencing is also in the chat. There's a lot of great info there. And you're also welcome to email Analiese, email us. If you have questions specifically about your neighborhood in District 1, planning and zoning related things, I am a resource in the district office to answer those, or at least connect you to the person who knows. So feel free also to reach out to me. I'm gonna type my email in the chat as well. It's naomi.grunditz@denvergov.org. And with that, if I think we're all ready to get on with our Friday and get into the weekend. And so I just want to thank Analiese again so much for spending her morning with us and all the work that she does leading this project. It's incredibly complex and emotional. You know, this is about our neighborhoods and where we live and who we live next to, and it's so important that we're all talking about this. So thank you, and thank you to all of you for being here. And I will let you go with that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for organizing, and feel free to reach out with any questions. So appreciate it.
Awesome. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.